make out a Christmas wish list, say a list of 10 items. And if you had them rank their 10 wishes from top to bottom, with the first being what they wanted the most, I would expect that you would not get any two lists that were identical. Nevertheless, I'd be willing to make a couple of wagers. First, I would bet that most people would have world peace on their list. And second, that it would be up near the top. Now, I expect there would be some who wouldn't include world peace on the Christmas list. Not because they're not interested in world peace, they're just more practical. They're probably thinking world peace is a nice idea, but it's not very likely, so why would I waste one of my 10 wishes on something that's not very likely? But others might just want to start smaller. Instead of world peace, they would be content with national peace, or even just peace at work, or at school, or at home. I wonder what sort of peace you would put on your Christmas list. In fact, I wonder, how do you envision peace? What does peace look like for you? How would you describe it to somebody else? Well, these are important questions, especially in this season of Advent, this season of eager anticipation, this season when we make preparations and we get ready for the one who was called the Prince of Peace. In his letter to the Christians in Rome, Paul writes that it is time for them to wake up from their sleep, for salvation is near. And then later on in the letter, Paul writes, "Let us pursue what makes for peace." Well, if we're going to pursue peace, then it would be helpful to have some idea, some picture of what peace looks like, so that we might know where to start searching for it, so that we might recognize it when we see it. When I was in seminary in my second or third year, I took a class in linguistics and language acquisition. The class was actually designed for future missionaries. And in it, we learned how to learn a second language. It was both theoretical and practical. We were instructed and introduced to cutting-edge research on brain development and how that relates to language acquisition. And then we were also given some very practical skills, like how to memorize, skills for doing that. And it was fascinating, and I can't tell you how much what I learned in that one 5-week intensive that I have used in other parts of my life, from how I learn to how I teach, and even to how I parent. There were things in that class that helped me. It was truly an amazing experience. And out of everything, there was one principle that I remember that governed the whole process that we were learning. And it was this: if you want to learn to speak another language, the most important skill that you need to develop is how to listen. After all, this is how we all learned our first language. When we were infants, we listened and heard our native language for about 12 to 18 months before we ever began to start speaking it. So listening comes first and then speaking. We find this same principle operating in other areas of life as well, other areas of learning. So for example, there was a book that came out in the 1970s. It's a book by Betty Edwards called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. Now, in this book, Betty, she's an art teacher, and she describes a process of how to teach people how to draw. And it's a rather unique process, or at least it was at the time. And so here's the type of problem that the book sought to address. Most of us adults, draw like we did when we were 10 years old. Why is that? if I were to sit down and draw you a picture of a person, you would all, I think, recognize that it was in fact a person, but it doesn't look like any person that you've ever met. Or if I were to draw the picture of an eye, you could recognize that it was an eye, but it wouldn't look like a real eye. And why is that? Well, it has a lot to do with brain development. Before we were about 10 years old, we used both hemispheres of our brain, both left and right. And then around 4th grade, we lateralized. And one of our hemispheres became more dominant than the other. And we began to rely upon one more than the other. And if you were like me, if you became left brain dominant, and you didn't keep up with your drawing, then you probably draw like you did when you were 10 years old. And here's the reason why. In the left hemisphere, that's where abstraction takes place. That's where we translate reality into symbols and representations. And so when I'm drawing, I'm not drawing an actual eye. I'm drawing my representation of an eye, an icon of an eye. And you can recognize it, but it doesn't look real. And this was the problem that Betty Edwards was having with teaching people to draw. And so, how would you teach somebody with my skills how to draw? Well, in drawing on the right side of the brain, you don't begin by teaching people the techniques of how to draw. The first thing you teach them is how to see. Because if you can teach a person to look at the world in the way that an artist looks at the world, then it's a much simpler process to then teach people to draw what they see. And so in her book, in her process, teaching people to draw was first about teaching them to observe, to see the world as an artist sees it. And it's fascinating. You can look at before and after pictures of what people drew, and then 3 months later what they were able to draw. From what looks almost like stick figures to what looks almost like a photograph. And it all had to do with focusing upon teaching them how to see. I think this is probably a bit of an exaggeration, but this was how the process was designed or described to me. If you took a class drawing on the right side of the brain, you'd show up for the first class, and they'd put a shoe in front of you, and they'd have you stare at the shoe for an hour. And then at the end of the hour, you would go home. Then you come back the second week, and they'd have you stare at the shoe for an hour. And then you go home. Then they would have you come back on the third week, and they would finally give you a pencil and a piece of paper. And instead of having you draw the shoe, you would be instructed to pick out a square inch of the shoe and to draw that. And again, what this process was teaching people to do was how to see. Instead of translating the world into representations, they begin to see the world as it was. And then they were finally able to draw what they were able to see. So what does all of this have to do with pursuing what makes for peace? It suggests to me that first and foremost, the pursuit of peace is about observation. If learning to speak a language begins with listening, and if learning to draw begins with learning to see, then might we say that pursuing peace begins with learning how to recognize peace, with deepening our understanding of peace through observation. Jesus calls all of us to pursue and practice peace because God has a vision for our world. God is pursuing a world in which all the peoples of the earth come to know God and know God's ways. A world in which soldiers become farmers and weapons of war become implements of agriculture. This description of the world of peace is presented in Isaiah. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Their tanks will become tractors and their missile silos will become grain silos. That last bit's probably not in your Bible. But you get the image of what Isaiah is sharing. In other words, in God's new administration, the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Education will get all the funding that they need, while the Department of Defense will probably have to throw a bake sale. That's God's vision of the world. Those are the sorts of things that are on God's Christmas list. But they may not be on our Christmas list. World peace just sounds too big, too impossible, at least in this life. Maybe we can imagine peace happening in the age to come, but not in our world. After all, as Deacon Amy so aptly put it, our world is broken, and it just keeps reminding us of its brokenness in startling and frightening ways. So we may not have any idea about what makes for peace. Therefore, we are not going to be able to pursue peace. But if that's the case, then maybe we simply need to start smaller. Maybe we need to start with observation and begin to cultivate our awareness of the peace that is about us. With learning to hear and see and taste the peace that is already present in our lives. So I've got an assignment for us. During this next week, let's begin to get very intentional about looking for peace. Peace has much to do with healing brokenness, with restoring and maintaining relationships, all types of relationships. The relationship between us and God, between us and our neighbor, between us and our heir. So as we go about our lives this week, let us look for and listen for evidence of peace. And when we find it, let's make a note of it. Literally, let's write it down. And then, let's bring it with us next week and put it in the offering plate. For peace comes from God. And the peace that God wants us to pursue, the peace that God wants us to learn, to practice, is the peace that God is already doing in the world. So as we look for evidence, for signs of peace in our world, and we write them down, and we come offer them to God, as always, we are offering back to God what God has already given to us. In the name of the Father, and the Son,